From Columbus to Cold War, how America's expansion set the stage for 1945 to 1989. Most people think America became powerful because of innovation, democracy, or hard work. But here is the real secret, and this is what we are going to explore together. America's Cold War dominance was not inevitable. It was built on a system of brutal extraction and displacement that began 5 centuries before the first Soviet threat ever emerged. And by the end of this video, you are going to see exactly how the genocide, slavery, and territorial theft of the colonial and early American era created the specific economic and ideological machinery that made America the only superpower left standing in 1945. Stay with me, because the connection between what happened to Native Americans in 1607 and what happened in Berlin in 1961 is far more direct than you have ever been told. If you lived through the Cold War, or you are now piecing it together from documentaries, you probably want the full picture without the spin. That is exactly what we are here to give you. And if this perspective is new to you, I want to invite you into the comment section below. Tell us what you thought you understood about America's rise, and what is shifting for you right now. We would love to hear from you. Also, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we are releasing deep dive breakdowns of every decade from 1945 to 1989, and you will not want to miss a single one. Now wait, this part is important, and I need you to focus here for a moment. What we are about to describe is not just history. It is the foundation of how power itself was understood and exercised in America for the next 3.5 centuries. This is why we have written a comprehensive guide to the colonial and Cold War eras, the mechanisms, the decisions, the turning points that most textbooks gloss over. You will find that guide in the description and pinned in the comments. It goes far deeper into the archives and the declassified reasoning behind every major move we are about to cover. This is where the full picture lives. Here is what gets left out of most Cold War narratives. By 1945, when America emerged from World War II as a superpower, it had already spent 330 years perfecting a specific kind of power. Not the power to convince, to negotiate, or to build consensus, but the power to dominate space, resources, and peoples through a combination of military force, economic incentive, and the psychological certainty that your civilization was inherently superior. This was not accidental. It was learned, it was practiced, and it became the template for how America would face down the Soviet Union for the next 44 years. When the first permanent English colony was established at Jamestown in 1607, the colonists faced a problem. They did not have the gold that the Spanish had found in Mexico and Peru. They did not have the spices that the Portuguese had found in Asia. What they had was land, millions of square miles of it, but the land was already occupied. So the colonists developed a solution that would echo through American history. They decided that the land did not really belong to the people who lived on it, because those people did not use it the way English people understood property. They did not fence it, they did not plow it into neat rows. They did not extract maximum resources from it as fast as possible. Therefore, in the colonists' minds, it was empty, available, open for taking. This idea, that land only has value when it is being exploited by people with capital and technology, became foundational to American expansion. It is crucial to understand this, because when America would later face the Soviet Union, the same logic appeared again. The Soviets controlled vast territory, the Russian steppe, Siberia, Central Asia, but in American eyes, it was not truly being used. It was being wasted on a communist system that did not maximize productivity or private profit. Therefore, it too seemed vulnerable, pressurable, capable of being converted or contained. The ideology was the same, only the vocabulary had changed. The colonists of Jamestown and Plymouth established a pattern that would repeat itself for the next 2 centuries. Arrive with a claim, establish a fortification, extract resources, first timber and furs, later tobacco, indigo, rice, and when the local population resisted, use military superiority to suppress them. When disease and warfare killed enough native people to create labor shortages, import enslaved people from Africa. When the territory filled with settlers and indigenous resistance hardened, move the frontier further west. This was not a chaotic process. It was systematic. It had a logic. It had a direction. and it required a particular kind of person, the settler who understood expansion not as morally ambiguous, but as civilizing, as progress. By the time of the French and Indian War in 1754, this settler ideology was deeply embedded in colonial culture. The war itself was fought partly over territory, who controlled the Ohio Valley, who could exploit its resources, who would expand into it next. The French, despite their greater familiarity with indigenous peoples and their willingness to integrate through trade and marriage, were defeated by the British. Not because they were worse fighters, but because the British colonies had a larger population, more capital, more sustained commitment to territorial expansion. The French wanted profit from the fur trade. The British wanted land for settlement. Settlement requires permanence, and permanence requires dominance. When Britain defeated France and took control of former French territories, including the vast Louisiana region, the settler impulse accelerated even faster. The question was no longer whether Americans would expand westward, but how quickly and at whose expense. And here is the thing that historians often miss. The American Revolution itself was partly driven by this hunger for Western land. The colonists did not rebel against Britain primarily because of tea taxes or abstract principles of liberty. They rebelled because the British government, after winning the French and Indian War, passed the Proclamation Line of 1763, which said colonists could not settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. London wanted to avoid the cost of protecting far-flung settlements and managing conflicts with indigenous nations. The colonists wanted to expand, so they overthrew British rule, partly to remove the obstacle to their expansion. In other words, American independence was not purely a victory for democracy and human rights. It was a victory for the settler class against imperial restraint. And once the British constraint was removed, American expansion accelerated dramatically. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 doubled the size of the young nation almost overnight. Lewis and Clark were sent westward not as explorers, but as scouts, to map resources, identify settlement locations, understand what indigenous nations controlled which territories, and report back on how easily those territories could be taken. This is the machinery that most Cold War documentaries completely skip over. They start in 1945, with America suddenly on top, suddenly the defender of the free world, suddenly opposed to Soviet expansion. But they do not ask, what in American history prepared the United States to understand the Cold War in the way it did? Why did containment, the policy of stopping Soviet expansion, feel so natural, so obvious, so morally righteous to American policymakers? The answer is that containment was not a new idea at all. It was the external application of a strategy Americans had been perfecting for 350 years. Identify a territory you want. Identify the people or power controlling it. Establish your military and economic presence. Contain their ability to expand. Gradually push them back. Replace them with your own system. The westward expansion of the 19th century involved what Americans called Indian removal, the forced displacement of millions of Native Americans from their ancestral lands to designated reservations, usually in the least desirable Western territories. Thousands died on the forced marches, particularly on the Trail of Tears when the Cherokee, Creek, and other southeastern nations were relocated to what is now Oklahoma. This was not a tragedy that Americans encountered. It was a policy that Americans implemented, often with the military. And the psychological toll of implementing it, the justifications required, the certainty necessary to believe that your civilization had the right to destroy another's, that created a particular kind of American state, a state comfortable with displacement, comfortable with imposing its system on others, comfortable with the language of civilization bringing. By the time the American Civil War erupted in 1861, the settler ideology had so thoroughly dominated American culture that the nation was willing to tear itself apart over the question of whether slavery, the labor system that powered the extraction economy, would be allowed to expand into new Western territories. Over 600,000 Americans died in that war, most of them not to end slavery, but to determine whether the North's industrial capitalism or the South's plantation capitalism would control the future of expansion. The North won, and American industrial expansion accelerated. By the 1890s, the continental frontier was officially closed. There was no more empty land to settle, so American expansion simply went overseas. American military and economic power extended into Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Hawaii, and throughout the Caribbean. American corporations seized control of resources in Central America. American interventions in Latin American politics became routine, justified by the same language. We are civilizing, modernizing, spreading order and progress. And then World War II happened. America had entered the war reluctantly, after Pearl Harbor, but once committed, American industrial capacity and military strategy proved overwhelming. By 1945, the United States had defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, and it had done so while maintaining or expanding its sphere of influence throughout the Western Hemisphere and the Pacific. But something new had also happened. Another superpower had emerged. The Soviet Union had bled itself white, defeating Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front, losing over 25 million people, but it had also claimed vast territories in Eastern Europe. Stalin's Red Army occupied Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. The Soviets had moved west. The Americans had moved east across the Pacific. For the first time, American expansionism faced not a collection of indigenous nations or a declining empire, but another industrial superpower with its own ideology, its own military, and its own vision of global order. This is where the connection becomes clear. The United States did not face the Soviet threat as a novel problem requiring novel solutions. America faced it as the latest iteration of a familiar pattern, a rival power controlling vast territories and peoples, that Americans believed should be organized according to American principles. The containment policy that Truman and his advisors would adopt, the strategy of using military power, economic incentives, and ideological messaging to prevent Soviet expansion, was not a new American invention. It was the American playbook, applied globally. And this is the revelation that makes the entire Cold War finally coherent. It was not a battle between two incompatible ideologies, capitalism and communism, fought on neutral ground. It was a collision between an established American expansionism, perfected over 350 years, and a Soviet expansionism that was only 28 years old. The Americans believed in their right to organize the world according to their values, because they had spent centuries doing exactly that. The Soviets believed in their right because they had just won the bloodiest war in human history and claimed territory as their prize. And the result was a global standoff that would last nearly half a century, a standoff fought through proxy wars, nuclear threats, espionage, and competing visions of modernity. Everything that follows, the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the space race, the Vietnam War, the détente period, the final arms race of the 1980s, everything becomes comprehensible once you understand that America and the Soviet Union were not fighting over abstract principles. They were fighting over which power got to define the world, and American leaders believed they should win because Americans had been winning that same argument for centuries. End of Part 1. That belief would be tested almost immediately. By 1950, Korea, a peninsula that had been unified under Japanese occupation and then hastily divided at the 38th parallel by American and Soviet planners who had never even visited the country, exploded into the first actual military confrontation of the Cold War. North Korea, supported and armed by Stalin, invaded the South. President Truman faced a choice that no American leader had faced before. Would the United States go to war to stop the spread of communism thousands of miles away, in a country most Americans couldn't find on a map? He chose war. Not because Koreans mattered most to American interests. They didn't. But because Truman believed that if America did not respond to communist aggression anywhere, allies around the world would lose faith in American power. This logic would define the entire Cold War. It was not about defending Korea. It was about defending the credibility of American dominance. The Korean War killed more than 2 million people, most of them Korean civilians. For what? The peninsula remained divided at almost exactly the same line where it had started. American casualties topped 36,000. The war ended not in victory but in exhaustion, an armistice signed in 1953 that essentially froze the conflict in place. It has remained frozen ever since. But the Korean War taught the American establishment something crucial. The American public would tolerate military action abroad if it was framed as defensive, as stopping something, preventing something, containing something. That lesson stuck. It would shape every military decision for the next 40 years. Meanwhile, at home, something remarkable was happening. The 1950s brought unprecedented prosperity to America. The GI Bill had educated millions of returning soldiers. The interstate highway system was under construction, the largest public works project in history. Suburbia was expanding. Consumer goods were abundant. Americans were getting richer, buying homes, having children, building lives in a way that seemed to validate everything America had fought for. The Soviet Union was also industrializing, also building, also claiming progress. But Soviet progress was happening at the cost of individual choice and personal freedom. Khrushchev had de-Stalinized the system somewhat after Stalin's death in 1953. There were fewer show trials, fewer mass executions. But the system remained totalitarian. Citizens couldn't own homes. They couldn't choose their careers. They couldn't read what they wanted or speak freely. Everything belonged to the state. Everything served the state. American leaders saw this contrast and believed it proved them right. Free markets produced abundance. Freedom produced happiness. Communism produced austerity and misery. They weren't entirely wrong about the material disparity, but they made a dangerous assumption that because America was materially ahead, America must also be ideologically correct. That assumption would lead to catastrophic miscalculations, because here's what American planners understood, but often didn't say out loud. The Soviet Union was a peer military power, but it was still weaker economically. The Soviet economy would struggle in any prolonged competition with America. So American strategy wasn't to defeat the Soviet Union militarily, it was to outlast it, to maintain military readiness while slowly strangling the Soviet economy through competition, to prove that American capitalism and American democracy could deliver a better life to more people. This was the essence of containment. The policy wasn't new. It had been articulated by diplomat George Kennan in 1946. But by the 1950s, it had become the organizing principle of American foreign policy. America would not attack communism where it already existed. That would risk direct war with the Soviet Union. Instead, America would draw a line and prevent communism from expanding further. Everywhere else, America would use its economic power, its military alliances, and its superior wealth to attract nations toward democracy and capitalism. But containment required one more thing, the belief that the United States could determine the outcome. It required faith that American power, American money, and American will could shape the world according to American interests. It required, in short, that Americans believe what they had believed for centuries, that history belonged to them. The complete mechanisms of how American power actually worked, how dollars flowed, how bases were positioned, how coups were orchestrated, how lies were told to justify intervention, all of this is explained in depth in the full Cold War guide available in the description and pinned comment. The guide breaks down the specific patterns of American expansion during this era, showing you exactly how the logic of containment translated into action on the ground. If you want to truly understand what happened next, that depth is essential. It's available now. The moment Eisenhower forced Britain and France to back down, he demonstrated American power. But in doing so, he also demonstrated something else, that America would protect its interests, even at the expense of its allies. Nasser learned that lesson. If he could not trust the West, he would embrace the Soviets. And the Soviets, watching from Moscow, understood that communism didn't need to be attractive. It only needed to be available as an alternative to American domination. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. For Americans, it was a shock. The Soviets, supposedly inferior and backward, had achieved a technological feat that America had not. Sputnik triggered panic. American newspapers ran headlines about falling behind. Congress demanded action. How could the Soviets beat America at anything? It seemed impossible. What Americans didn't understand at the time was that Sputnik was partly a bluff. The Soviets had thrown immense resources at a single, spectacular achievement. Their economy couldn't sustain that pace. Their space program was less reliable than America's. But that didn't matter to the public perception. Sputnik felt like proof that communism might actually work, that the future might belong to the Soviets after all. By the end of the 1950s, Eisenhower had been president for 8 years. He had kept America at peace, he had managed the containment of communism, he had presided over the greatest period of prosperity in American history. Americans were wealthier, more educated, more secure than ever before. The future seemed bright. Yet in that same address, Eisenhower warned against something he called the military-industrial complex. He feared that the permanent merger of military spending and industrial profit would distort American democracy and lead to wars fought not for security, but for economic interest. It was a prophetic warning, but it came too late to matter. The machine was already in motion. John F. Kennedy arrived at the White House in January 1961 with a conviction that Eisenhower had been too cautious. The Soviets, in Kennedy's view, were aggressive and expanding. America needed to match that aggression with its own. Kennedy believed in American superiority, but not as a comfortable fact to be maintained. He believed it as a challenge to be proven again and again against a determined and capable adversary. Yet beneath that idealism lay a dangerous assumption that American will and American power could reshape the world according to American interests. Kennedy and his advisors believed they could fight multiple wars simultaneously, against communism in Vietnam, against Soviet influence in Latin America, against communist expansion everywhere. They believed America's economic strength and military power were unlimited. That belief would soon be tested. Castro's revolution had been a disaster for American interests, not because communism was expanding in Latin America, though that was happening, but because Cuba was close to America, too close. It was a humiliation. An American-backed dictator had been overthrown in America's backyard, and America had done nothing to stop it. Worse, the new regime was explicitly anti-American and was accepting Soviet support. In April 1961, the invasion began. American-backed Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs, expecting that the Cuban people would rise up and join them, that Castro's government would collapse. None of that happened. The invasion was a catastrophe. Castro's forces overwhelmed the exile brigade within days. More than 100 exiles were killed. Over 1,000 were captured. The entire operation was a public humiliation for Kennedy and for America. Kennedy was humiliated. But more importantly, he had sent a message to the Soviets. America would take military action to try to contain communism, even when the odds were terrible and the operation was doomed to fail. That message would have consequences. Khrushchev interpreted the Bay of Pigs invasion as a sign that Kennedy was reckless, that the new American president could be bullied. That interpretation would lead directly to the most dangerous moment of the entire Cold War. In the summer of 1961, Khrushchev made a decision. He would place Soviet missiles in Cuba, not to attack America, but to deter American invasion and to demonstrate that the Soviet Union could match American power even in America's sphere of influence. It was a gamble, but given the logic of the Cold War, tit for tat, move and countermove, it made sense. The Cuban Missile Crisis lasted 13 days. It was the closest the world came to nuclear war during the entire Cold War. Kennedy faced a choice. He could invade Cuba, which might trigger a Soviet response elsewhere, perhaps an invasion of Berlin or an attack on American allies in Europe. Or he could blockade Cuba, which would stop Soviet ships from delivering more missiles, but might lead to a direct military confrontation. Or he could negotiate, which would be seen as weakness. Kennedy chose blockade. American naval ships circled Cuba, preventing Soviet supply vessels from approaching. The world held its breath. Soviet ships approached the American blockade. For a moment, it seemed the world was on the edge of a confrontation that would end in nuclear war. Then, at the last moment, the Soviet ships turned around. Khrushchev blinked first. The Cuban Missile Crisis resolved, but it left profound scars. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev realized they had nearly destroyed the world over a game of geopolitical chess. In 1963, they would sign the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the first concrete agreement of the Cold War era. It was a small step, but it represented mutual recognition that nuclear war was unthinkable. For the first time since 1945, there was a sense that the two superpowers might be able to coexist without destroying civilization. That moment of mutual recognition was brief. By 1963, other forces were already in motion that would shatter the tentative peace. By 1964, America was about to step into a war that would consume the next decade and tear apart everything the Cuban Missile Crisis had briefly held together. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, whether real or imagined, gave President Johnson the pretext he needed. Destroyers, radar signals, a phantom attack in the darkness. The details hardly mattered. What mattered was that America was now committed to a land war in Southeast Asia, a war that would drag in 500,000 troops, kill 58,000 Americans, and fundamentally alter how the nation saw itself. Vietnam was different from Korea. Korea had been swift, cold, bordered by clear geography. Vietnam was a jungle that swallowed certainty. Soldiers fought an enemy they could not see. Villages that seemed peaceful harbored guerrilla networks. And every year, the death toll climbed, while the objective remained unclear. Hanoi would not surrender. The North Vietnamese and their Viet Cong allies had something the Americans underestimated. They had a cause. This was their homeland. They had already fought the French for 8 years. They would fight Americans for as long as it took. Back home, something was breaking. Young Americans who had grown up under the shadow of nuclear annihilation began to question why they were dying in a country most of them could not find on a map. The peace movement grew. Protests erupted on college campuses. Mothers held photos of their dead sons. Journalists reported what they saw. Not the sanitized victory narratives from the Pentagon, but the messy, ambiguous reality of a war that seemed unwinnable. Détente, that hopeful word from French meaning relaxation, became the theme of the late 1960s and 1970s. After Vietnam had ground on for years with no end in sight, both superpowers recognized they needed to step back from the brink. Strategic Arms Limitation talks, SALT, began in 1969. The idea was radical. Instead of racing endlessly to build more weapons, why not agree to limit the arsenal? Nixon and Kissinger pursued a policy of realpolitik, dealing with the Soviet Union as a great power, with its own legitimate interests, not as an existential enemy to be crushed. But here is where I need your full attention for just a moment. Détente was not the end of competition, it was the reshaping of it. While Americans and Soviets signed treaties in the 1970s, proxy conflicts continued in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Soviet advisors were in Angola and Ethiopia. American CIA operations worked to destabilize leftist governments across Latin America. The two superpowers had not stopped their struggle. They had simply agreed not to annihilate each other while continuing it by other means. The guiding principles and hidden mechanisms behind this new phase of the Cold War, how détente actually functioned as a tool of power rather than a true peace, those are explored in depth in our comprehensive guide available in the description and pinned comment. This is where the deeper strategy becomes clear, and it transforms how you understand what comes next. The space race, which had seemed to pause after the moon landings of 1969, became another arena for Cold War competition. But by the 1970s, both nations had achieved their symbolic victory. The Americans had won the race to the moon, but that victory felt hollow when viewed against the body bags coming home from Vietnam, the cities burning with social unrest, the sense that America's moment of unchallenged dominance was slipping away. The 1970s were years of American doubt. The economy stagnated. Oil prices soared. The dollar weakened against other currencies. Unemployment rose. Inflation ate away at paychecks. Young people who had once believed in progress now questioned whether progress was even possible. Some of this was cyclical, economic patterns that affect all nations. But some of it was structural. America had spent 2 decades building a global military presence, fighting expensive wars, and maintaining an empire. The bill was coming due. When Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, he arrived with a different message. After years of détente, of managing decline, of accepting Soviet parity as permanent, Reagan believed America could win again. His strategy was military buildup, more weapons, more defense spending, more confrontation. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire. He authorized the production of new missiles in Europe. He supported anti-communist insurgencies around the world. The early 1980s saw the Cold War intensity again. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979 to support a communist government being challenged by American-backed Mujahideen fighters. The conflict became another drain on Soviet resources, their own version of Vietnam. Military spending on both sides accelerated. By 1983, Soviet General Secretary Yuri Andropov was so convinced that Reagan planned a nuclear first strike that the Soviet military went on high alert. The world came closer to accidental nuclear war than it had since the Cuban Missile Crisis. But Reagan also understood something that his predecessors had missed. The Soviet system was hollow. It spent enormous resources on military might, but its economy could not sustain it. The Soviet Union was spending 15 to 17% of its GDP on defense, while the American economy was larger and more efficient. The Soviets could not compete indefinitely in an arms race with a nation that had superior technology and deeper pockets. By 1985, a new Soviet leader took power, Mikhail Gorbachev. He was younger, more reform-minded, and he understood that the Soviet system needed to change. He introduced glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. These were attempts to save the Soviet system by making it more transparent and efficient. But in a totalitarian state, built on secrecy and control, openness was like adding a spark to a powder keg. Once people could speak freely, once they could see how badly the system was failing, the machinery of repression could not be put back together. Now, here is where the story reaches its turning point. As the 1980s progressed, the Reagan administration and Gorbachev began talking to each other again. Reagan, for all his anti-communist rhetoric, recognized that Gorbachev was different. They met in Geneva in 1985, then again in Reykjavik in 1986. They discussed arms reduction not as a way to manage parity, but as a way to actually eliminate weapons. The tone changed. The rhetoric softened. Both leaders seemed to recognize that the ideological struggle could end not with one side conquering the other, but with both sides stepping back. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. For 28 years, that concrete barrier had divided a city, a country, a continent, and a world. On November 9th, crowds of East and West Berliners gathered at the wall with hammers and pickaxes and sledgehammers. They pounded at the concrete. They danced on top of it. They cheered as the barrier that had symbolized the entirety of the Cold War came down, chunk by chunk, piece by piece. The guards watched and did nothing. The Soviet tanks did not roll. Moscow had decided not to intervene. The dissolution of the Soviet Union followed in 1991. The system that had once seemed an eternal rival, that had forced America to live under the shadow of nuclear annihilation, dissolved not in war, but in weakness. The Soviet economy could no longer sustain the military-industrial complex. The republics that had been held together by force sought independence. The communist ideology that had promised to remake human nature had lost its hold on people's hearts. When the red flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, it was not because America had defeated it militarily, but because it had failed economically and morally. And this brings us to the revelation I promised you at the beginning. America's expansion across the North American continent, the contest for dominance across the globe, the nuclear standoff with the Soviet Union, all of this was not inevitable. It was the result of choices made by countless leaders and ordinary people across 4.5 centuries. Columbus sailed west looking for spices. Instead, he opened a door to conquest. English colonists landed on the Atlantic shore. They built a society that believed in expansion as destiny. American revolutionaries broke from Britain. They inherited the assumption that the continent was theirs to possess. 19th century Americans pushed westward. They assumed it was their right to displace indigenous peoples and Mexicans. And 20th century Americans, possessing the world's largest economy and the most terrible weapons ever invented, assumed they could manage the entire world according to American interests. The Cold War was the culmination of all that expansion, the moment when America faced another superpower, also claiming dominance, also possessing atomic bombs, also convinced of its own righteous cause. But here is what is crucial to understand. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the underlying logic of American expansion did not end. The contest for global dominance did not cease. A new world order was proclaimed. American unipolarity, the end of history, the triumph of the Western system. Yet within a decade, America would be fighting a new war in Iraq. Within 2 decades, China would emerge as a rival superpower. The patterns established over centuries, the belief that American interests should shape global affairs, the willingness to use military force to achieve strategic objectives, the assumption that American prosperity depends on global dominance. These patterns did not end with the Cold War. They evolved. The Cold War from 1945 to 1989 was not an aberration. It was the mature expression of forces that had been building since Columbus, a nation born from expansion, built through westward movement, enriched by slavery and the displacement of indigenous peoples, and accustomed to seeing the world as its sphere of influence. That nation could not help but clash with another superpower that held similar assumptions about its right to dominance. The nuclear weapons, the proxy wars, the ideological struggle between capitalism and communism, these were the forms that the underlying competition took. But the competition itself was rooted in the deepest currents of American history. When you understand the Cold War this way, not as a sudden emergence of Soviet-American rivalry from nowhere, but as the outcome of centuries of American expansion meeting an equally expansionist Soviet system, you see the era with clarity. The decisions made by Kennedy and Khrushchev, by Johnson and Ho Chi Minh, by Reagan and Gorbachev, these were not made in a vacuum. They were the inevitable collisions between two systems competing for supremacy in a world that had been reshaped by centuries of American expansion. So here is the challenge I leave you with. Think about the world you see today. China rising, America responding, tensions in the Middle East, resource competition, technology races, military alliances being redrawn. These are not new patterns. They are the continuation of logics established centuries ago. Understanding the Cold War is not about living in the past. It is about seeing the present clearly. It is about recognizing that the structures of power, the assumptions about dominance, the willingness to use force to achieve national interest, these did not end in 1989. They transformed. And if you understand the transformation, you understand the world you actually live in. This is the story of how America's relentless expansion across continents and centuries set the stage for the Cold War, and how the end of the Cold War did not end the underlying competition it expressed. Thank you for watching this journey through one of history's most consequential eras. If this clarity resonates with you, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss an episode, and leave a comment below telling us what surprised you most about this connection between America's past and the Cold War itself. Hit that notification bell so you are always first to see when we upload, because there are more chapters of this story to explore. We will see you next time.